you, Annie, for that very generous introduction. It is really terrific for me to be here and see so many good and old friends. Once again, I was visiting down there before we came up with the dean, your former governor. I told him the one about the two guys eating lunch in the prison cafeteria. The one looks at the other and says, you know, he says the food was better here when you were governor. That has nothing to do with Garrett. And as a matter of fact, I stole a joke from Alan Simpson, so I gotta give him credit. It's terrific to see Manny here. Manny, as he told you, he and I served together in 41's cabinet. Manny served with great distinction, as of course did Pete, and I'm going to say more about that later. But I need to tell you a little bit about why that book has that title, Work Hard, Study, and Keep Out of Politics. It's a facetious title, of course, but it was the advice that my grandfather used to give the young lawyers who came to work at our family law firm. He said, if you want to be a good lawyer, work hard, study, and keep out of politics. And that was the mantra that guided the first 40 years of my life. And I was sort of raised to believe that politics was something below really good lawyers, a dirty process that you didn't involve yourselves in. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up finding myself with a second career in politics and public service. And the first thing that happened was the loss of a wife to cancer when she was only 38 years of age. Leaving me with 4 small sons. But I had a good friend in Houston at the time who happened to be my tennis doubles partner. And he came to me and he said, you know, Bake, you need to take your mind off your grief. How about helping me run for the Senate? And I said, well, George, I said, that's a great idea except for 2 things. Number 1, I don't know anything about politics. And number 2, I'm a Democrat. And he said, well, you know, we can change that ladder. We can cure that ladder. In those days, I got to tell you, in those days, everybody in Texas was a Democrat. We have not elected a Republican statewide since Reconstruction, except for John Tower, who ran against 4 Democrats, 1 Republican, 4 Democrats, and therefore won, to take Lyndon Johnson's seat when Johnson went on the ticket to Kennedy. And so when I'm talking to a group of Republicans, I say that I've got religion. And when I'm talking to a mixed group, I say I changed parties. So you can take it either way you want, but I did, and we ran a close race. It was interesting and sort of tweaked my appetite a little bit and my interest in politics. One thing led to another. I found myself up in Washington as the Deputy Secretary of Commerce in Jerry Ford's administration. And the second tragedy struck, which was the loss to President Ford of his delegate, Hunter, in an automobile accident. His delegate, Hunter, in the contest for the Republican nomination against Ronald Reagan in 1976. President Ford asked me to become the delegate, Hunter. And I left Commerce, went over to the President Ford Committee. It's where Pete and I first met. I'm going to say more about that later. And we barely won the nomination against the challenge of Governor Ronald Reagan from California. We only won by 100 delegate votes out of some 3,000 delegate votes that were on the floor in Kansas City, 1976, the last seriously contested convention of either major political party in our history. And that was really fascinating, and that tweaked my appetite a bit more, piqued my interest for politics. And after the convention, President Ford asked me if I would chair the general election campaign against Jimmy Carter. And I did, and we started off 25 points behind. And on election day, we were dead even. President Ford lost that election to Jimmy Carter by only 10,000 votes out of 81 million votes that were cast. In the Electoral College, you turned 10,000 votes around that year in Ohio and Hawaii, and Ford would have been elected, and Carter would never have had his picture on the wall in the White House. And that was really close, and I'll never forget thinking to myself at 3 o'clock in the morning after Election Day, thinking to myself, boy, is this bizarre. 7 years ago, you were a Democratic lawyer in Houston, Texas, and now you would run a campaign for an incumbent Republican president in what is clearly going to be the closest presidential election of your lifetime. But if you followed what happened in the year 2000, you will know that it wasn't the closest president. Anyway, by that time I was fully bitten by the bug. I thought to myself, you know, you practice law for 16 or 17 years. I'm going to go home and see if I can get my feet wet in politics a little bit. And I filed to run for statewide office in Texas, notwithstanding the totally democratic character of the state. I never will forget one hot summer day somewhere up in the Panhandle, little town up there, and I see some people at a shopping center, and I go over to give them some campaign literature. Bear in mind now, I've got a lot of face time as Ford's national chairman on national television. And I go over to this guy, stick out my hand and introduce myself to him, and before I can say a word, he looks at me and he says, "Say." He said, "Anybody ever tell you you look like Jim Baker?" And I smiled back at him and I said, "Yes, sir, often." He never batted an eyelash. She said, "Doesn't it piss you off?" I had that I wasn't going to win that. And sure enough, I didn't. And it's probably a good thing, or I would never have had an opportunity to be Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, some of the other things where I had the pleasure of working with this great senator of yours, and with Gary, and with Manny, and with others. So let me begin with that true story for you about politics. And tell you, I've been asked to speak to you a little bit about some of the global challenges facing us today, and I'm going to do that. But first, I really want to tell you what a privilege it is to be with all of you who have gathered here and who are pursuing this goal of this institute to recognize a true giant in American politics and public service. I don't have to tell New Mexicans. You don't need to have a neighbor from Texas come tell you how great Pete Domenici is, but I'm here to tell you that he is, because for more than 4 decades, he's demonstrated time and again that he's a public servant who's not like your normal public servant. He takes a long-range approach to addressing a lot of complicated issues like energy and nuclear proliferation and the federal budget. And during my experience with him of more than 8 years, both as White House Chief of Staff, working closely with him, and as Secretary of the Treasury, and then a bit less so as Secretary of State, he does all this with a laser-like focus on results. He's interested in getting things done. People used to, particularly some members of the more far-right part of my party, used to get after me. They'd say, "You're too pragmatic, you're too interested in results, you're likely to sacrifice a principle for pragmatism." Well, that's not my definition of pragmatism. Pragmatism, in my view, is understanding and recognizing that we elect our leaders to get things done, to accomplish anything. I never will forget how many times I'd be sitting there at the right hand of Ronald Reagan as his Chief of Staff, after running 2 campaigns against him, by the way. I never did understand. I could never understand why he asked me to be his Chief of Staff. But you know, people would say that somehow we weren't letting Reagan be Reagan. Well, it was such baloney. And I'd sit there at his right hand, and he said, tell me many times, "Jim, I'd rather get 80% or 70% of what I want than to go over the cliff with my flag flying." And I think that's the way Pete Domenici has operated